Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Fujifilm GFX 100S II, a medium format mirrorless camera with 102 megapixels, built-in stabilization, and 4K video. Announced in May 2024 and costing $5,000 or pounds, it's the successor and replacement to the GFX 100S from 2021. Fujifilm's priced the new version at a lower point than the $6,000 or £5,500 initial price of the original 100S, although you may find that discounted for closer to $4,400 or £3,500 while stocks last. Either way, it is considerably cheaper than the current flagship GFX 102, seen here, which costs $7,500 or £7,000. I spent a few days with the final production model, and in this review I'll show you around the camera and point out where it differs not only from its predecessor, but also the higher end top model in the series. At first glance, the GFX 100S II looks almost identical to its predecessor, sharing the same dimensions, shape and control layout, but Fujifilm fans will notice the new Bishamon text finish inherited from the flagship GFX 102. Either way, it's a solid weather-sealed camera with a decent sized grip that feels great in your hands, not dissimilar to an old school DSLR, and at 883 grams including battery, similar in overall heft too. Like the original GFX 100S, it's impressively portable considering the large sensor that's inside. In terms of physical controls, there's a lockable PASM mode dial on the upper left shoulder with 6 custom positions and a switch to select between stills and movies. Meanwhile, on the upper right shoulder, the GFX 100S II inherits the info screen of the 100S, a 1.8-inch e-ink display with 303 by 230 pixels that's used for context-sensitive shooting information, mostly adjusted by the front finger and rear thumb dials, which, by the way, are both clickable. Like the 100S before it, you can reverse the display, so you're looking at black characters on a white background or vice versa. It also shares the same 3 views, cycling between detailed information depending on the mode, virtual dials, and my own personal favourite, a nice large live brightness histogram. On the rear, there's an 8-way joystick and focus mode lever, along with a scattering of buttons. Moving on to composition, Fujifilm's taken the opportunity to upgrade the electronic viewfinder over its predecessor, so it's out with a 3.69 million dot panel with 0.77 times magnification, and in with a more detailed 5.76 million dot panel with a larger 0.84 times magnification. Now, while this still falls behind the size and resolution of the flagship GFX 102, I have to say the viewfinder on the 100S II is still gorgeous in use and a highlight of shooting with the camera. Like other GFX cameras, the square and native shape of the sensor means that you can use the full height of a viewfinder panel, and it really delivers an immersive experience that encourages you to shoot more. I loved it. Meanwhile, the main monitor remains the same as before, a 3.2-inch touchscreen with a tri-axial mount that can angle 90 degrees up, 45 degrees down, or 60 degrees out to the side. Since most owners will stay behind the camera, I don't feel it misses out too much on not being able to face forward. On the right side, inside the substantial grip, a twin SD card slot supporting UHS 2 speeds. Note that the flagship model also accommodates a CF Express card, and that does allow it to write its bursts out faster. Meanwhile, on the left side are the same ports as the GFX 100S, so from top to bottom you have 3.5mm microphone and headphone jacks, USB-C, micro HDMI, and a PC sync port. No wired Ethernet here. USB-C can be used to charge the battery and camera, and now also supports external SSDs to unlock ProRes video recording. I tried it with a SanDisk 1TB drive, which was recognised, but like the 102, you can't record to both SSD and SD cards simultaneously, nor trigger any kind of backup onto the drive later. I think that would be a useful feature if it could be done. The camera also supports USB tethering and can double up as a USB webcam if you like. Imagine doing a YouTube live or Zoom call with a medium format camera. The HDMI port can output 12-bit RAW video to either an Atomos or Blackmagic recorder, a feature that will delight videographers while they simultaneously curse whoever chose the tiny micro HDMI port. There's also Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and now support for Frame I/O to upload photos or videos to the cloud for backup or collaborative projects. You'll also notice a menu for connecting to Instax printers, but only the discontinued ones with Wi-Fi, sadly not the current ones with Bluetooth. Boo! And finally, for the body tour, the GFX 100S II is powered by the same NPW235 pack as its predecessor, not to mention larger X-series bodies. But by implementing the most recent image processor, power savings have now extended its life. Fujifilm quotes 530 versus 460 photos, or 80 mins of 4K video versus 60 mins, and I actually managed to achieve roughly those times in practice. At the heart of the GFX 100S II is a 102 megapixel sensor, which Fujifilm describes as having quicker readout than the previous model, which in turn allows faster bursts and reduced rolling shutter, more about which in a moment. Like other 102 megapixel models in the series, this captures images with up to 11648 by 8736 pixels in their native 4:3 shape. Lower resolutions of 51 and 12 megapixels are also available, and each of these three sizes can be recorded in a choice of 6 alternative cropped aspect ratios. The sensitivity ranges from 80 to 12800 ISO, with an extended low setting of 40 ISO and extended highs up to 102,400 ISO. There's also the choice of fine, normal, or superfine compression for JPEG or HIF files, along with uncompressed, lossless, or compressed options for RAW, in addition to 14 or 16-bit depth. Unsurprisingly, there's also the latest complement of film simulations to choose from, including the most recent Reala Ace, and all of those monochrome, grain, and color chrome effects that you know from previous models. I'll show you a load of new sample images later in the review, but for now let's have a look at my standard test shot and gradually zoom in to reveal the kind of detail that's possible with 102 megapixels. Whether you're zooming in post or on the camera itself, it feels like you can just keep getting closer and closer and closer. Like other 102 megapixel GFX models, it's a tremendous amount of potential detail, at least under the right conditions. But if you want even more, you can try out the pixel shift mode that records a bunch of raw files that are to be combined in software later to generate a new file with up to 400 megapixels worth of detail, in theory. Like other pixel shift modes though, this requires a static subject to avoid undesirable motion artifacts. And don't even think that a landscape is going to be completely still, as foliage and trees, birds flying past, cars, people, they're all in motion, so it could prove problematic. And sadly, the software that actually combines them wasn't yet updated to support this camera at the time I made this review. But you can see examples in my earlier GFX reviews if you're interested to see what it could do. Like its predecessor, the GFX 100S II has sensor shift stabilization, or IBIS for short, but Fujifilm now claims up to 8 stops of compensation versus 6 on the older model. So here's a shot that I took at 1/5 of a second using the 45mm lens. That's roughly 36mm equivalent. This is the slowest speed that I could handhold a sharp image with IBIS enabled. Now let's put that image on the left with a version taken at the same shutter speed but without IBIS on the right, and the difference is clear. I actually needed a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second to match the result on the left but without IBIS, and that corresponds to about 4.5 stops of compensation. Now that may be less than the 8 stops that I previously mentioned from the specs, but looking back at my results from the previous GFX 100S, I actually only managed 3 stops with the same lens on that body. Now obviously conditions change, but in this test the IBIS was certainly more effective on the new model versus the old one, and it allows you to enjoy that full resolution of the sensor when shooting handheld under a wider variety of conditions. I mean, shooting sharp 100 megapixel images at 1/5 of a second, that's pretty impressive. The latest X Processor 5 also brings enhancements to the autofocus, including subject detection for animals, birds, cars, bikes, planes or trains. Meanwhile, the human face and eye detection remains on a separate menu, with the most recent selection overriding the last. Here you can see the GFX 100S II focusing on a fairly close subject with the 45mm lens at f2.8. I used a single area here and you can see it refocusing on the background, but being a bit more hesitant when returning to the closer bottle. I should note this only seemed to affect the closest subjects in my tests, and in more general use I didn't find the focusing held me back in any way. It can vary with different lenses and may not be as snappy as the best full frame or APS-C systems, including Fujifilm's own, but it does remain fast for a medium format camera. Speaking of speed, the GFX 100S II has increased its top mechanical burst speed from 5 to 7 frames per second, in fact just 1 frame slower per second than the flagship GFX 100 II, which was strongly marketed on its speed. In my tests, I fired off 16 uncompressed 14-bit RAW files in 2.22 seconds, and that corresponds to a speed of 7.2 frames per second, and it confirms the faster mechanical burst speed. But it then took 26 seconds to fully empty the buffer onto a UHS-2 card. Now, to be fair, shooting JPEGs will give you much deeper bursts and shorter write times, but my raw test does illustrate a limitation of using SD cards to record 100 megapixel bursts versus the flagship GFX 102, which has a CF Express slot to exploit faster cards. So yes, the GFX 100S-II can shoot faster than its predecessor and almost as fast as the flagship, but if you're shooting raw bursts, be prepared to wait for them to write onto the slower memory cards. Moving on to video, the GFX 100S-II can film 1080 at 24 to 60p or 4K from 24 to 30p, both in either 16:9 or wider DCI shapes, and with an uncropped horizontal field of view. I managed over an hour of 4K 25p on a full battery at room temperature without overheating warnings. There's a variety of encoding options including H.264 and 265 for internal recording onto SD, or ProRes options at higher bit rates if you connect a compatible SSD drive to the USB-C port. Here's how the footage looks at 1080 25p using the 45mm lens. And now for 1080 at 50p, which shares the same uncropped field of view. And next, here's 4K at 25p, again uncropped and showing more detail than before. Note the flagship 102 adds 5.8 and 8K, albeit the latter with a crop, along with high-speed 1080 video, all of which are absent on this more affordable model. But if you're into grading, there is at least F-Log 1 and 2, as well as the chance again to output Atomos or Blackmagic recorders in the RAW format. Now for a quick focusing test in video, again with the 45mm lens at 2.8. Here you can see the camera sometimes nailing the focus pull, but at other times hesitating, making for a slightly inconsistent experience. Now I've seen this before for video autofocus on GFX, not to mention some X-series bodies, and find them best at locking onto mostly static subjects rather than tracking one that's moving. Again though, your mileage may vary. Next for stabilization for video, starting with a clip filmed using the 45mm lens without IBIS where the footage is wobbly. Next, here's the result with IBIS enabled, which is much steadier, although there's still a few minor wobbles visible. Some improvements may be had by enabling the IBIS Plus DIS mode, which uses additional digital compensation in return for a crop. And finally, if the subject is mostly static, you could also enable the Boost IS mode, which does a better job at locking onto the subject. I would say overall though, the IBIS DIS and Boost modes look a little less effective here than on a modern X-series body. Do check out my XT50 review to see what I'm talking about in practice. And finally, a quick test for rolling shutter, starting with 1080 at 25p, where there's a little skewing if you really throw the camera from side to side, but it's not too bad considering the sensor resolution that it's starting with. It's also reasonably well behaved in 1080 50p, as you can see here. And now for 4K at 25p, where there looks like a little more visible skewing than at 1080. The sensor readout may be faster than before, but for the best results, just don't shake the camera around too much. Okay, now it's time for my final verdict, and as I wrap up this review, I'll show you a selection of photos that I took with the GFX 100S-II and 45mm lens. All the JPEGs out of camera, and you can take a closer look at some of them in my review page at cameralabs.com. The GFX 100S-II updates the smallest and most affordable model in Fujifilm's 102 megapixel medium format series. It delivers essentially the same photo quality with a tremendous amount of detail on single frames, and even the chance to boost it to up to 400 megapixels worth with pixel shift, at least under the right conditions. But by improving the sensor readout and coupling it with the latest image processor, the new camera enjoys improved subject detection, faster burst speeds, and more effective stabilization, not to mention longer battery life, and the latest Reala Ace film simulation. And while the physical side of the camera is almost identical to its predecessor, the GFX 100S-II boasts a larger and more detailed electronic viewfinder that's gorgeous in use, along with inheriting the classy finish of the flagship GFX 100-II. Now these may not be groundbreaking upgrades, and the faster bursts will be limited by the speed of the SD card slots, but given that you're getting all of that at a lower initial retail price than the original GFX 100S, the new model represents good value overall. That said, do keep an eye open for discounts on its predecessor while stocks last, in particular in the UK where the body can be had for as much as £1,500 less. I know that I'd happily take that saving and invest it in lenses or a nice trip. But as stocks of the original 100S dry up, the new 100S-II will become the most affordable entry to Fujifilm's 102 megapixel medium format system, delivering fantastic detail from a body that's similar in heft to a Pro full framer. So tell me in the comments what you think of this latest GFX camera and the series as a whole. If you had £5 to spend on a new camera, would you go down this route or perhaps a top-end full-frame body instead? And as always, if you find my reviews useful, please do consider giving this video a like and my channel a follow. It all really helps. Which only leaves me to thank you for watching and bid you a fond farewell until next time. Bye bye.